Walk along any European marina today, from the Mediterranean coast to the North Sea, and you'll notice something disturbing. Rows of boats sitting perfectly still. No movement, no maintenance, no owners. Some have been there for months, others for years. Their hulls gathering algae, their decks covered in grime, their engines frozen in time. These aren't just abandoned vessels. They're monuments to a financial catastrophe that nobody saw coming. And what I'm about to reveal will fundamentally change how you think about recreational boating, luxury purchases, and the hidden forces that can turn dreams into nightmares almost overnight. By the end of this investigation, you'll understand why thousands of boat owners across Europe simply walked away from investments worth tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars. You'll learn about the secret financial mechanisms that trapped them, the warning signs that were ignored, and most critically, the pattern that's repeating itself right now in other markets. This isn't just about boats. It's about a system that encourages ordinary people to make extraordinary financial commitments, then leaves them stranded when the tide turns. Stay with me, because the third act of this story involves a revelation so unexpected that it's forcing economists to reconsider everything they thought they knew about consumer behavior in the 21st century. It begins in the spring of 2020, but not where you'd expect. While most of the world was locked down, staring at screens and counting the days until normal life resumed, a different kind of fever was taking hold along the coasts and lakeshores of Europe. Boat dealerships from southern Spain to northern Germany started receiving calls, lots of calls. Families who had never owned a boat before, couples in their 30s and 40s with stable incomes and savings accounts, suddenly wanted in. The conversations were remarkably similar. People talked about freedom, about escaping confined spaces, about creating memories while there was still time. For the first time in decades, boats weren't just toys for the wealthy or fishing enthusiasts. They became symbols of possibility, of reclaiming control in a world that felt increasingly chaotic. Showrooms that had operated for years in quiet predictability suddenly found themselves overwhelmed. By the summer of 2020, waiting lists stretched for weeks. By autumn, they stretched for months. Manufacturers scrambled to respond, but the supply chain, already strained by global disruptions, couldn't keep pace. What happened next set the stage for everything that would follow. Across Europe, first-time boat buyers poured into the market in numbers that shattered every historical record. In the United Kingdom alone, boat sales surged by percentages not seen since the economic boom of the early 2000s. France reported similar spikes. Spain, Italy, and even Scandinavian countries, where boating culture runs deep, saw unprecedented demand from demographics that had previously shown little interest. These weren't just casual browsers. They were serious buyers, often arriving at dealerships with pre-approval letters from lenders, ready to sign contracts the same day. Dealers recall the atmosphere as electric. Some showrooms emptied within hours of receiving new inventory. Boats that would typically sit on the lot for months sold before they even arrived. And it wasn't just small recreational vessels. Mid-sized cruisers, sailboats, and high-performance powerboats all moved at a pace that defied logic. The frenzy created a feedback loop. As inventory disappeared, the perception of scarcity intensified. Friends told friends. Social media groups dedicated to boating swelled with new members, sharing tips on where to find available boats and which dealers might have incoming shipments. Prices began to climb. Used boats that would have sold for a fraction of their original value just a year earlier now commanded premiums. Some sellers found themselves in bidding wars, with buyers offering above asking price just to secure a deal. For those who managed to purchase a boat during this period, the experience felt validating. They had beaten the odds, secured something valuable during a time of shortage. What they didn't realize was that the same forces driving their enthusiasm were quietly setting the stage for a collapse that would leave thousands of them trapped. The financial architecture of boat ownership in Europe operates differently than in many other markets, and understanding this is critical to understanding what happened next. Unlike car loans, which are relatively straightforward, boat financing often involves more complex structures. Many buyers, especially first-time owners, turn to marine-specific lenders and specialized financing programs offered through dealerships. These programs, designed during years of stable demand, made ownership appear accessible. Interest rates in 2020 and early 2021 were at historic lows. Central banks across Europe had slashed rates to near zero, and lenders, flush with capital and desperate to deploy it, offered attractive terms. For qualified buyers, it was possible to finance a boat with minimal down payment and monthly installments that seemed manageable against their household budgets. But embedded in these contracts were clauses and conditions that most buyers either didn't read carefully or didn't fully understand. Depreciation clauses, variable interest rate triggers, provisions that allowed lenders to reassess value and demand additional collateral if market conditions shifted. In a rising market, none of this mattered. Boats held their value or even appreciated, and refinancing or selling was easy. But in a falling market, these same clauses would become trapped. At the same time, dealers themselves were operating under financial pressures that amplified the cycle. Many European boat dealers rely on credit lines to purchase inventory from manufacturers. These credit lines, known in the industry as floor plan financing, allow dealers to stock their showrooms without paying up front. Instead, they pay interest on the inventory until it sells, at which point they repay the principal and pocket the margin. During the boom, this system worked beautifully. Inventory turned over quickly, interest costs remained low, and dealers could afford to expand their offerings. But as manufacturers ramped up production to meet surging demand, dealers found themselves pressured to take on more inventory than historical sales patterns justified. Manufacturer incentive programs sweetened the deal. Order a certain number of units, and dealers could unlock rebates, co-op advertising funds, and priority allocation for the most popular models. For small and mid-sized dealers, turning down these programs meant risking their relationships with key brands and losing competitive advantage. So they signed, they ordered, and they borrowed. By late 2021, European marinas and inland waterways were busier than they had been in decades. Everywhere you looked, new boats dotted the water, many helmed by owners still learning the basics of navigation and seamanship. Boating schools reported record enrollments. Marine supply stores couldn't keep life jackets, fenders, and dock lines in stock. The mood was celebratory, almost euphoric, but beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Consumer behavior during the pandemic followed patterns that economists now recognize as predictable, but were harder to see in real time. With travel restrictions in place and entertainment options limited, households across Europe redirected spending. Money that would have gone to vacations, concerts, and dining out instead flowed into durable goods, home renovations, recreational vehicles, and yes, boats. Savings rates spiked as people cut discretionary spending, creating reservoirs of capital that felt safe to deploy on big-ticket purchases. But this shift was temporary, driven by circumstances that wouldn't last. By mid-2022, restrictions were lifting. Airlines resumed full schedules. Hotels reopened. The urge to travel abroad, suppressed for 2 years, came roaring back. Suddenly, the boats sitting at the marina competed not just with other leisure activities, but with long-delayed trips to Greece, Portugal, or the Caribbean. For many new boat owners, the realization came slowly. The boat that had seemed essential in 2020 now felt like a burden. Maintenance schedules were more demanding than expected. Mooring fees, insurance, winterization costs, all added up faster than anticipated. And the time commitment, weekends spent cleaning, repairing, and simply getting the boat ready to use, often exceeded the time actually spent on the water. Data from marine service centers and mooring facilities began to reveal the pattern. Boats purchased in 2020 and 2021 were logging far fewer hours than historical averages. Some sat unused for entire seasons. Owners, stretched thin by competing priorities and rising costs, simply stopped using them. but they didn't sell, not yet. Selling meant admitting a mistake, taking a financial loss, and dealing with the hassle of finding a buyer in a market that was starting to cool. So the boats stayed, tied to docks, covered with tarps, waiting. And as they waited, their value began to erode. Then the macroeconomic environment shifted in ways that turned a cooling market into a crisis. Starting in late 2022, central banks across Europe began raising interest rates to combat inflation. The European Central Bank moved aggressively, increasing rates at a pace not seen in over a decade. For boat owners with variable rate loans, the impact was immediate and severe. Monthly payments that had been comfortably affordable suddenly jumped by hundreds of euros. Household budgets that had absorbed boat ownership during low-rate years now strained under the weight of higher debt service. At the same time, broader economic uncertainty took hold. Energy prices spiked. The cost of living surged. Real wages stagnated or fell. Discretionary income, the lifeblood of recreational boating, evaporated for many middle-class families. Faced with a choice between paying the mortgage, covering daily expenses, or keeping up with boat payments, the decision was obvious. But walking away from a boat isn't as simple as walking away from other assets. Unlike a car, which can be driven away or repossessed relatively easily, a boat requires coordination with marinas, transport companies, and lenders. And as more owners tried to sell, the market flooded with supply. Listings on online marketplaces multiplied. Prices dropped, then dropped again. Boats that had sold for premium prices in 2021 now struggled to find buyers at discounts of 30, 40, even 50%. For owners who still owed more on their loans than the boats were worth, a situation known as negative equity, selling became impossible without coming up with cash to cover the difference. Many didn't have it, and so, one by one, they made a different choice. They stopped paying, they stopped maintaining, and in some cases, they simply disappeared. Marina operators across Europe began noticing the trend in early 2023, but by 2024, it had become impossible to ignore. Boats that hadn't moved in months, owners who stopped returning calls, unpaid mooring fees accumulating month after month. Some owners were transparent, contacting marinas to explain their situations and arrange payment plans or surrenders. But many others vanished without a word, leaving behind vessels that legally belonged to lenders but physically occupied spaces that marinas couldn't easily clear. The legal framework governing abandoned boats varies significantly across European countries, and this patchwork created a bureaucratic nightmare. In some jurisdictions, marinas have the authority to seize and sell boats after a certain period of non-payment. In others, they must go through lengthy court processes, often requiring them to locate the registered owner and serve formal notices. Meanwhile, the boats sit, deteriorating, occupying valuable dock space that could be generating revenue. For smaller marinas operating on thin margins, the financial impact was devastating. Each abandoned boat represented lost income, mounting storage costs, and legal expenses with no clear resolution in sight. Some marina operators hired private investigators to track down owners, only to discover that many had moved, changed contact information, or simply refused to engage. Lenders, too, found themselves in uncharted territory. Repossessing a boat is more complicated than repossessing a car. Boats require specialized transport, often involving cranes, trailers, and logistics companies. Once repossessed, they need to be stored, maintained, and eventually sold, all at considerable expense. And in a flooded market, the resale value often doesn't cover the costs of repossession and sale, let alone the outstanding loan balance. As a result, some lenders chose not to repossess at all, writing off the loans as losses and leaving the boats in legal limbo. By mid-2024, estimates suggested that thousands of boats across Europe were effectively abandoned. Not all were visible. Some sat in storage yards, others remained on trailers in driveways or tucked away in private marinas. But the ones most visible, the ghost boats lining public docks and commercial marinas, became symbols of a broader collapse. journalists began covering the phenomenon. Local news stations ran segments showing rows of neglected vessels. Boating industry publications, once filled with advertisements for new models and glowing reviews, now featured articles about the crisis, interviewing marina operators, lenders, and former owners. The human stories behind the statistics were often heartbreaking. Families who had stretched their budgets to buy a boat during the pandemic, hoping to create lasting memories, now faced ruined credit, legal battles, and the emotional weight of a failed dream. Some owners described feeling trapped, unable to sell, unable to afford, and ashamed to ask for help. Others expressed anger at lenders and dealers who they felt had encouraged them to overextend. The emotional toll was real, but so was the financial carnage. What makes the European ghost boat crisis particularly instructive is how it reveals vulnerabilities in the broader system of consumer finance. Boats, like many recreational vehicles, occupy a strange middle ground in lending. They're not essential like housing or transportation, so lenders can't rely on the same assumptions about borrower commitment. But they're also expensive enough that defaults can result in significant losses. During the boom, lenders underestimated how quickly demand could evaporate and how dramatically values could fall. Risk models built on historical data didn't account for the unprecedented surge of first-time buyers, many of whom lacked experience in boating and underestimated the total cost of ownership. When the market turned, these borrowers were the first to default, and their boats, often barely used, flooded the secondary market, driving prices down further and accelerating the cycle. Dealers, caught in the middle, suffered alongside owners and lenders. Those who had aggressively expanded inventory during the boom now found themselves holding depreciating assets financed with expensive debt. As sales slowed and inventory aged, the interest costs on their floor plan loans mounted. Some dealers tried to discount their way out, slashing prices to move inventory, but this only drove prices lower market-wide, hurting everyone. Others held firm, hoping for a rebound that never came. By late 2024, reports emerged of dealerships across Europe closing their doors. Family-run businesses that had operated for decades, weathering previous downturns, couldn't survive this one. Employees lost their jobs, suppliers went unpaid, and the boats, still new, still sealed in some cases, sat in showrooms that would never reopen. The ripple effects extended into manufacturing. European boat builders, many of them small to mid-sized companies concentrated in countries like Italy, the Netherlands, and Sweden, had ramped up production during the boom. They hired workers, invested in new equipment, and signed contracts with suppliers. When dealer orders evaporated, they were left with completed boats and no buyers. Some manufacturers pivoted to international markets, shipping unsold inventory to regions where demand remained stronger. Others cut production drastically, laying off workers and scaling back operations. A few filed for insolvency. The collapse of the boating boom, much like the outboard engine crisis documented in the United States, illustrates how industries can be reshaped by short-term demand spikes that feel permanent but aren't. It also highlights the human cost of these cycles, the individuals and families who made decisions based on the information available to them, only to find themselves trapped when conditions changed. Now, here's where the story takes its most unexpected turn, and why this matters far beyond the world of recreational boating. Economists studying the European ghost boat phenomenon have identified patterns that mirror collapses in other markets, from real estate to cryptocurrency to collectibles. The cycle is remarkably consistent. First, an external shock disrupts normal behavior, in this case the pandemic. Second, a surge in demand driven by a combination of liquidity, restricted alternatives, and emotional drivers. Third, supply-side actors, manufacturers, dealers, lenders, respond by expanding capacity and loosening credit. Fourth, the initial shock fades, behavior normalizes, and demand collapses. Fifth, a wave of defaults and distressed sales floods the market, driving prices down and creating a feedback loop. What's particularly striking is how quickly the cycle completes. From the initial surge in 2020 to widespread abandonment by 2024 is just 4 years. In that time, thousands of people went from excited new owners to defaulting borrowers. The speed of the collapse caught nearly everyone off guard. But in hindsight, the warning signs were visible. The unsustainable pace of sales growth, the entry of inexperienced buyers with limited understanding of true costs, the aggressive expansion of credit, the disconnect between short-term enthusiasm and long-term commitment. All of these were present, but they were ignored or downplayed in the rush to capitalize on the moment. The ghost boats sitting in European marinas today are more than just abandoned vessels. They're artifacts of a collective miscalculation, evidence of how markets can amplify human behavior in ways that seem rational in the moment, but prove destructive over time. And they're a warning, because the same dynamics are playing out right now in other sectors. The surge in RV purchases during the pandemic has followed a similar trajectory, with reports of abandoned motorhomes and trailers appearing across North America and Europe. The boom in home renovations and luxury home goods has given way to a secondary market flooded with barely used items. Even in areas like fitness equipment and hobby gear, the pattern repeats. Enthusiastic purchases made during lockdowns, followed by disuse, followed by attempts to sell into saturated markets. The lesson isn't that people shouldn't buy boats or RVs or pursue their interests. It's that the financing structures and cultural pressures that encourage big purchases during moments of emotional intensity often don't account for how quickly circumstances and priorities can change. And when they do change, the consequences can be severe, not just financially but emotionally and socially. For the owners who walked away, the decision was rarely easy. Many described feelings of shame and failure, as if abandoning a boat represented a deeper personal shortcoming. The cultural narrative around ownership, especially ownership of luxury or aspirational items, equates possession with success and letting go with defeat. This narrative makes it harder for people to make rational decisions when circumstances change. They hold on longer than they should, spending money they can't afford, hoping for a turnaround that doesn't come. By the time they finally walk away, the financial damage is often far worse than it would have been if they had acted earlier. Marina operators, too, faced impossible choices. Many felt sympathy for owners they knew were struggling, but they also had businesses to run, employees to pay, and obligations to meet. The abandoned boats created a moral and practical dilemma. Should they aggressively pursue legal action against owners who might already be financially devastated? Or should they absorb the losses and hope to weather the crisis? Different marinas made different choices, and there's no clear consensus on which approach was right. What's clear is that the crisis exposed weaknesses in the systems designed to manage these situations, legal, financial, and operational, and those weaknesses remain largely unaddressed. As of 2025, many of the ghost boats are still there. Some have been auctioned off at steep discounts, purchased by opportunistic buyers or salvage companies. Others have been broken down for parts, their fiberglass hulls destined for landfills or recycling facilities. A few have been seized by authorities and sold to cover unpaid fees, though the proceeds rarely cover the full cost. And some simply continue to sit, legal battles unresolved, owners untraceable, their presence a constant reminder of what happens when optimism collides with reality. The environmental impact is also a growing concern. Boats left unmaintained leak fuel, oil, and other contaminants into the water. Fiberglass and plastic degrade over time, releasing microplastics. Electrical systems corrode and batteries fail, creating hazardous waste. Environmental groups have called for stronger regulations and better enforcement, but with limited resources and unclear ownership, progress has been slow. The ghost boats, intended as vessels for leisure and freedom, have become floating monuments to waste and neglect. Looking forward, the question isn't whether these cycles will happen again, They will. Human behavior, market dynamics, and the structure of modern consumer finance ensure it. The question is whether the lessons from the European ghost boat crisis and similar collapses will lead to meaningful changes. There are signs that some lenders are tightening standards, requiring larger down payments and more stringent income verification before approving boat loans. Some dealers are adopting more conservative inventory strategies, resisting the temptation to overstock, even during strong sales periods. And some buyers, chastened by stories of defaults and losses, are approaching major purchases with more caution, asking harder questions about total cost of ownership and long-term value. But these adjustments are incremental and not universal. The fundamental incentives that drive boom and bust cycles remain intact. Manufacturers want to maximize production and revenue. Dealers want to move inventory and capture market share. Lenders want to deploy capital and earn interest. And consumers, driven by emotion, social pressure, and optimistic assumptions about the future, want to buy. When all of these forces align, the result is predictable: a surge, a peak, and then a collapse. The ghost boats of Europe are a warning written in fiberglass and steel, visible to anyone willing to look. They tell a story about the fragility of value, the speed of market shifts, and the human cost of financial decisions made in moments of collective enthusiasm. They remind us that in a world where credit is easy and the future feels uncertain, the line between dream and disaster can be dangerously thin, and they raise uncomfortable questions about accountability. Who bears responsibility when markets collapse? The buyers who overextended, the lenders who approved risky loans, the dealers who pushed inventory, the manufacturers who ramped up production. The answer, unsatisfying as it may be, is everyone and no one. Each actor made decisions that seemed rational within their own context, but collectively those decisions created a system prone to instability. Fixing it would require coordination and foresight that markets driven by short-term incentives struggle to produce. So the ghost boats remain, silent witnesses to a moment when thousands of people believed they were securing freedom and adventure, only to discover they had purchased something far more complicated. They stand as evidence that in the modern economy, value is less stable than we imagine, that ownership can become a trap, and that the forces shaping our financial lives are often beyond our control. For anyone considering a major purchase, especially one tied to lifestyle or aspiration rather than necessity, the lesson is clear. Understand the full cost, not just the purchase price, but the maintenance, the financing, the opportunity cost, and the exit strategy. Ask what happens if your circumstances change, if the market shifts, if your priorities evolve, and be honest about whether the purchase serves a genuine, sustainable need or whether it's driven by the moment, by social pressure, by a desire to capture something fleeting. Because the boats in those European marinas, slowly deteriorating, legally contested, financially underwater, they all began as something else. They began as dreams. Dreams of sun-drenched afternoons on calm water, of family gatherings and freedom from routine. Dreams that felt so real, so attainable, that thousands of people signed contracts, took on debt, and committed to a future they believed would last. Those dreams didn't fail because they were false. They failed because the world changed faster than anyone expected, and the structures meant to support them, financial, legal, emotional, weren't built to adapt. The ghost boats are what's left when dreams meet reality and reality wins. They're a monument to optimism betrayed, to the gap between expectation and outcome, and to the speed with which fortune can reverse. And they're still there, waiting in marinas across Europe, patient and silent for whatever comes next.